when wars end, they end for one of three reasons. The third way in which killing stops, and this is the most likely, when you have what is called a frozen conflict. So the armies are still facing each other, but on a given moment they stop shooting, bombing, but they don't withdraw their armies. No agreements have been reached. And we have a number of examples of that. North and South Korea.
Well, speaking of mistakes of dictators, I suppose we should come on to Ukraine, which is perhaps the defining issue.
It doesn't have one.
It doesn't, but Russia does, and Russia, according to many, has made an enormous mistake in going in there. I'd be interested to get your take on that. Can Ukraine win, do you think? Or are we in the West perhaps suffering from a bit of a delusion that it's even possible to
well, it depends what you mean by the word win. If you mean can they, because although they get help from the West, a lot of help, they don't get boots on the ground.
Not yet.
They're not going to get them. The British, America, because the America, Britain, France, Germany, all their allies said, we support you, we will provide you with military assistance, we will provide you with training, but we are not going to send our troops in to fight Russians, because that could lead to the Third World War between nuclear weapon states. And much though we want to help Ukraine, we're not going to risk a Third World War by having a direct war with Americans fighting Russians or Brits and Frenchmen fighting Russians. So Ukrainians, you ask, can they win? No, if you mean by that, can they recover the 18% of their territory that is currently controlled by the Russians? On all the evidence, it is almost inconceivable they can do that over the next few years. One day they might be able to, depending on what happens in Russia, but not now. However, doesn't mean Putin wins in the sense that he would like to win. He started this war not just to gain some territory in the east of Ukraine. He basically wanted to destroy the independence of Ukraine as a state. He does not believe, or he chooses not to believe, that Ukraine deserves to have a country of its own. And he forgets that it was the Soviet Union itself, Boris Yeltsin, who decided to allow the Soviet Union to disintegrate. And that's when Ukraine became a state. The Ukrainians wanted it. They'd never been allowed it, like the Baltic states. They all wanted it. It wasn't NATO that forced it. It was Yeltsin, when he was the president of Russia, said, actually, these countries are all more a nuisance than an asset. Let them go their own way. And they did go their own way. So it is ironic that Putin somehow tries to blame the West for that.
But what about the West's reaction to the invasion and the consequences? Putting your foreign secretary, former foreign secretary's hat on, has, for example, Britain handled this the best way, do you think?
Well, the first action by Putin to grab territory was not 3 years ago. It was in 2014 when he annexed Crimea and he just basically took over Crimea. Ukraine then had virtually no army of its own. The Ukraine army today is almost 800,000. At that time, the army was about 20,000. So he annexed Crimea, and I don't believe the West, if the West then, America, not just Britain, America, Britain, all the Western countries, had done what they did 3 years ago in terms of sanctions, expelling Putin from the G7, a whole range of penalties, that would have prevented that. I think that would have been much more likely to prevent the actual invasion we saw 3 years ago. So I think a mistake was made then. In terms of how the international community has reacted in the current war, I think it's been fantastic. The unity that has been, not 100% unity. Hungary has been awkward. Trump is being difficult. But the European countries as a whole have remained, if anything, more supportive now than they were even 2 or 3 years ago.
Should there be NATO/EU forces on the ground in a peacekeeping capacity? Something of that order?
Well, peacekeeping sounds a nice neutral remark, user-friendly.
There has to be a peace to keep.
Well, first of all, if the Russians were to break a peace treaty and reinvade Ukraine, what do the peacekeepers do? Do they actually fight back, or do they simply say, you're not supposed to do this? Now, I said, for reasons I said earlier, British troops, French troops, American troops are not going to be fighting Russians. That's my view. And I see no evidence that any of these governments are thinking otherwise. But there are other ways you can preserve the peace. And the first has to be that we have a whole range of sanctions against Russia. Yes, if there's a peace treaty that allows them, that allows the war, the fighting to stop, then sanctions should be gradually reduced. But when wars end, they end for one of three reasons. Either one side wins and the other loses, which is not going to happen here. All the military judgments, and they may be wrong, but their best judgment is that Russia is making progress in gaining more territory, but so slowly. It would take them 50 years to control the rest of Ukraine, and they don't have the power to do that. So normally, if you can't have one victor and one loser, you have both sides realizing we have to have peace and compromising. Now, if you have a negotiated peace, that means not only the Ukrainians must compromise by recognizing they're not going to get Crimea back or some of the other territory at this moment in time, but the Russians must also compromise. They must also recognize that Ukraine is going to continue as an independent country, able to determine its own foreign policy and not be told by Russia what it's got to do. Now, Russia at the moment is not prepared to compromise. It may change, but it's not at the moment. The third way in which killing stops, war, people stop killing each other, is when you have, and this is the most likely, when you have what is called a frozen conflict. So the armies are still facing each other, but on a given moment they stop shooting, bombing, but they don't withdraw their armies. No agreements have been reached. And we have a number of examples of that. North and South Korea. They have technically been at war since 1951 when the fighting stopped. There's never been a peace treaty, but they've never invaded each other. Think of Kashmir, India and Pakistan. Occasionally you have minor conflicts, but they've never really gone to war in the big deal.
And that's what you think in the end will happen with it?
Not in the end. I think in the short term that's what's going to happen. Because until Russia is prepared to compromise, you cannot get a long-term peace treaty. And Putin, because of the sort of guy he is, he's not shown any indication. This is where Trump got it wrong. Trump thought by the sheer brilliance of his diplomatic skills, he would persuade Putin that peace was the right solution. I think Trump is a peacemaker, actually. I'm saying very rude things about him. The one thing I find a relief and agreeable, Trump does not like wars. Do you know why he doesn't like wars? Because he's a businessman, and wars interfere with trade.
Yeah.
Businesses don't function, can't make their profits if countries are fighting each other. And I'm being a bit unfair, but he doesn't. He is a peace. He would like to be able to claim that he made the peace, but he's not been able to do that.
Which brings me neatly to, this is about the future. That's what this sort of talk is about. And looking at the future of global geopolitics, is there a path to peace in our near future? Can we have a global peace without a single great power? Because that question suggests that the single great power, since certainly the end of the Cold War.
I won't ask you to think back more than 2,000 years.
Please don't.
But can you tell me any time in the last 2,000 years when this
Global
paradise that you have mentioned was actually achieved?
Well, I suppose the point of this is a global power, hyperpower,
Yeah.
as you say, hasn't exactly brought peace, not since the end of the Cold War on all sides.
To be fair, between 1815, Battle of Waterloo, end of Napoleon,
1914.
and 1914, apart from the Crimean War, which was very short, a couple of years, there was peace in Europe. Franco-Prussian.
Yes.
Yeah, there were a number of localized. Yeah, you're quite right.
The Balkans, perhaps, but yes.
There were localized conflicts,
Yeah.
but Europe as a whole did not have anything remotely like the Napoleonic Wars, or the 100 Years' War, or the First World War, or the Second World War. So relatively speaking, that was a time of...
But do you see that as a possibility
Yes.
going forward from where we are?
Well, you said possibility, not probability.
Okay.
It is possible, but I don't think it's going to be possible until either Putin recognizes he can't achieve what he would like, or Putin disappears and we get somebody else more willing to contemplate compromise
Right.
in Russia.
Do you think that's a likelihood? You said possibility.
It is more difficult in Russia than it is in a democracy, because the people who Putin surrounds himself with are all hard-headed. But, I mean, if Putin was to have... if he was to disappear, he had a heart attack today, and they suddenly had to produce a new leader, I can't predict what would happen, but there is at least a strong possibility that even someone who's as much a bad guy as Putin, he could do what Putin can't do. He could say this war has to come to an end. It wasn't my war. It was Comrade Vladimir Putin who decided to have this war. And I and my colleagues agree now's the time to. That's at least a significant possibility. So will it happen? Probably not. Might it happen? Yes, it might. What are the odds? I wouldn't put my own money on it, but there we are. It's entirely logical. This is not airy-fairy. The Russians know, and Putin within himself knows, that he's made a complete Horlicks of this conflict. He thought he was advised by his advisors, because in their system, your advisors tell you what they think you want to hear. And he was told the war would last 3 weeks. The Ukrainians in Kiev would be grateful that their fascist government, neo-Nazi government, had been overthrown. Thank you, Comrade Vladimir, for liberating us. And he wanted to believe it. And he's now in this ghastly mess.
And one point I wanted to ask you is about the nature of democracy. You mentioned the change that's been so great in countries like South Korea and Taiwan and others that have become democracies. Democracy is usually lauded as having the advantages of stability and legitimacy that autocracies lack. But do you think that's still the case?
Well, it depends what you mean by stability. Yes, of course, if you're a dictator and you're...
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.